Okay, so I know we've been away from the Romans for quite some time. We've been looking into Japanese theater history and we've been looking into theater in early Africa and in the early Americas. But we're going to zoom back to the Romans now. Well, we're going to zoom back to the end of Roman theater as we had looked at it earlier this semester. So, when we last left the Romans, theater was becoming more and more coarse, kind of raunchy, vulgar, because it had to compete with chariot racing and gladiator contests and things like that. And Roman theater had actually already reached its height during the 4th century CE, Common Era. It continued as a publicly supported institution for another 200 years, but it was starting to encounter difficulties that were going to become its undoing. So, theater in Europe is starting to slowly, it's going to start to slowly fail as we work our way through this slideshow. We're entering a little bit of a dark time for theater. One source of strong opposition to theater in ancient Rome was the rising Christian church. So at first, Roman Christians were actually persecuted. They were not in any kind of position of power, and they were persecuted because they refused to worship any other gods. And ancient Rome was a polytheistic culture. They believed in more than one god. The Christians did not. They only believed in one God. So at first, Roman Christians were persecuted because they only believed in one God and they refused to worship the emperor as if he were a god. And this was getting them in a bunch of trouble. But in spite of this, the power of Christianity gradually increased and increased and increased. And unfortunately for theater, the Christians really targeted it and really wanted to take away the popularity of theater and to kind of shut down theater. So why? Why was theater such a favorite target of the Christians? Well, number one, it was associated, as we've talked about, with festivals of pagan gods. So the Christians weren't big fans of the fact that there were a lot of people who worshipped what they considered to be pagan gods. And all these festivals that involved theatrical entertainment were worshiping pagan gods. Number two, the Christians and the church leaders were morally offended by the scandalous nature of those mime performances. Remember way back when we were first talking about theater in ancient Rome, and we talked about those mime performances where there was like live adultery happening on stage and things like that. The Christians were not fans, and they wanted to shut that down. And number three, mimes often ridiculed Christian practices like baptism and the sacrament of bread and wine. Those things were usually ridiculed in mime performances. So, of course, the Christians didn't like being ridiculed, and that was another reason for them to want to go after theater and try to shut it down. So, the break between the church and theater is inevitable. Um, Christians who attended theater instead of going to church were excommunicated from the church. Actors had to quit their profession if they wanted to receive the sacraments of the church. And in addition to all of this, Roman theater was actually doomed anyway because the Roman Empire itself was decaying. That sense of loyalty to the state, which used to be so strong in Rome, was actually increasingly getting undermined and weakened after the 2nd century Common Era CE, as the military and the government took over all functions and they just ignored any kind of citizen concern. And by the 6th century CE, Roman Empire had lost all semblance of unity. There was no united front in Rome, and the Roman Empire really just wasn't a strong, united front anymore. So it was easier for the Christians to continue to take over and to start to dismantle previously beloved cultural practices like theater. And we'll continue on the next slide. I'll see you there.